Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see so many colleagues. For those of you I don't know, my name is Rebecca Bell Chavez. I'm President and CEO of the Inter-American Dialogue, and I'm so pleased with the high level of interest in today's event. I think it really is a reflection of our shared understanding of the challenges that lie ahead for President Arévalo. And I think we're all aware of the breadth and magnitude of those challenges. They include, of course, deep-seated corruption. It includes a captured justice system, which is a really tough one, social exclusion, citizen insecurity, poverty and inequality, and at the same time, exceedingly high expectations from Guatemalans demanding change. Several of us were in the National Theater on June 14th. I see Manuel is here and Ambassador McFarland. And we waited there for over 9 hours. And this was after a 5-month campaign, largely waged by the Attorney General to overturn the will of the Guatemalan people who elected Arévalo on August 20th, with a resounding 21% margin. So due to the last-ditch effort to prevent Arévalo from assuming the presidency, as I said, he didn't take the stage until after midnight. He entered the room to the first chords of Vivaldi's Spring, a very powerful symbol of the resurgence of democracy after years of decline. And if you forgive me, if I take the metaphor a bit further, we're all thrilled about this spring, but it could end very quickly and usher in a new winter. Yes, Guatemala has a lot to teach us about the ability of democracies to resist authoritarian backsliding, but the turbulent lead up to the inauguration is just one indication of the challenges the new president faces when it comes to fulfilling his very wide-reaching agenda. So today we have the opportunity to hear from 3 expert panelists on how to ensure Guatemala's spring endures, including, of course, the continued engagement of Guatemalan civil society that was so instrumental in the lead up to the inauguration. And of course, it includes a very broad and vibrant civil society that includes indigenous groups, youth, NGOs, and members of the private sector. As we'll also hear, along with the mobilization of Guatemala's vibrant and diverse civil society, international pressure was a key factor in preventing what Arévalo himself called a coup attempt. So it is essential that the international community and the US, and we're so grateful to have Eric here, support the new Guatemalan government. So I'm going to do a quick introduction of today's 3 speakers. First, we have Eric Jacobstein, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs. Eric's portfolio is a big one. It includes Central America, Cuba, and regional migration. Eric has deep knowledge of and experience in Latin America and the Caribbean, including Special Advisor on Western Hemisphere Affairs for Vice President Harris, National Security Council Director for Central America and Cuba, and Senior Advisor in USAID's LAC Bureau, and as Staff Director of the Northern Triangle Task Force. Before his service in the executive branch, Eric spent 15 years in Congress, including a period as Senior Policy Advisor on the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. And during this time, I know you from this period, and I can say that Eric was consistently a very compelling voice on the need to devote attention to the Western Hemisphere. And finally, Eric is an American Dialogue alum. Second, we'll hear from Ana Maria Mendez Dardon, who is Director for Central America at the Washington Office on Latin America, WOLA. We're very fortunate to have you with us, Ana Maria, with your deep expertise on Guatemala, including your own experience as a parliamentary advisor to the Guatemalan Congress. Ana Maria is also an expert on human rights, on gender issues, on judicial reform, and on the rule of law more broadly. And her past experiences include a time working with the United Nations. And finally, we'll have the opportunity to hear from Juan Luis Font, a renowned investigative journalist and anchor and founder of Con Criterio, the highly regarded media outlet that focuses on Guatemala. Juan Luis also spent close to 2 decades as director of El Periódico, which reported on Guatemala. It's worth noting that this outlet closed its doors in 2023 as a result of judicial harassment of its staff. And Juan Luis was forced into exile in 2022 after facing legal intimidation and harassment from Guatemalan authorities. So we are so lucky to have these three with us. And I'm going to turn over to you first, Eric, and then we'll go in order.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you today and for giving us all this space to really reflect on the incredible events that have taken place in Guatemala over the past 6 months. And more importantly, Rebecca, I'm just grateful for your exceptional leadership of the Inter-American Dialogue. And as you note, as a Dialogue alumni, it's always wonderful to be back here and honored to be on a panel with Ana Maria and Juan Luis for all their incredible work in this space. So grateful for that. And I'm really thrilled, Rebecca, to join you to discuss U.S. efforts to support the democratic transition in Guatemala, mostly because it was a significant effort from an incredible U.S. government team, both in Guatemala City and in Washington. And I'm very proud of our success. I'm also excited to look forward, look ahead, and discuss how the international community can continue to support the Guatemalan people in the weeks and the months ahead. So from our perspective, failure to uphold democratic institutions and the will of the people in Guatemala would have undermined our collective efforts to adequately address the root causes of irregular migration. This was an outcome that we as a US government were not willing to accept. And so together with the international community, particularly the Organization of American States and the European Union, the Biden-Harris administration took decisive action to support the Guatemalan people's demands that their selection of the ballot box be respected. And first and foremost, this was a testament to the Guatemalan people, and we're very proud of the role we played to support it. From the very start of an extremely lengthy transition period, we consistently saw corrupt and undemocratic actors seeking to overturn Bernardo Arévalo's electoral victory by a large margin, as Rebecca pointed out. The Guatemalan Attorney General's office not only seized electoral materials, but also sought to remove prosecutorial immunity from Supreme Electoral Tribunal officials. And each time the Attorney General's office or other corrupt actors made a move, we were ready to respond, working very closely with other members of the international community, including through the OAS, including through partners, the EU. Perhaps most importantly, the Biden-Harris administration, we used all tools at our disposal to ensure accountability. And this included the imposition of visa restrictions on over 300 Guatemalan individuals, including current and former Guatemalan officials and their family members. We also designated Miguel Martinez, former President Giamatei's close advisor, under the Global Magnitsky Sanctions Program for his role in corruption in Guatemala. And these actions, these tools that we used, they were complemented by positive engagement to very publicly demonstrate the inevitability of a democratic transition in Guatemala. So what did this include? This involved high-level visits from the Deputy Secretary of State, Rich Verma. I was with him in early September 2023 for that visit, just a couple weeks after the second round. Vice President Harris's National Security Advisor, Phil Gordon. Our Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment, Jose Fernandez, to show the impact of positive economic cooperation. And our Assistant Secretary, Brian Nichols. It also included high-level outreach to President-elect Arévalo at the time from the Vice President, from Secretary Blinken, from National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. All of these steps, in addition to the sort of the sticks, the harder line pieces, the tools that we use, it was critical to do this, to exercise this positive engagement. And finally, I just think it's important to mention that the U.S. Embassy team in Guatemala City really did what diplomats do best. They brought various sectors together, particularly leaders from the indigenous community, from the private sector, to hash out differences and to support democracy in the country. And it's really hard to overstate the phenomenal role played by our team in Guatemala City. Despite efforts of corrupt and undemocratic efforts, our feeling was that the writing was on the wall. The international community stood united well past midnight on Inauguration Day, as Rebecca pointed out, to finally witness President Arévalo's oath of office. As the U.S. presidential delegation was led by Samantha Power, the administrator of USAID, and the message from Administrator Power and her delegation was that the U.S. remains committed to the Guatemalan people and wants to continue to strengthen the U.S. partnership with the country. President Arévalo and the delegation agreed to work closely on shared strategic priorities, including advancing economic prosperity, including security, and democratic governance. And that work has already begun. To maintain momentum, the United States and Guatemala will soon conduct a high-level economic dialogue to advance Vice President Harris's Central America Forward initiative by promoting investment, creating jobs, reducing poverty, and essentially addressing the root causes of migration. The United States will also soon welcome a new class of 400 individuals in the Academy of Women Entrepreneurs, a program that helps equip marginalized women who want to grow their businesses in Guatemala. At the same time, we know that economic opportunities only matter if people feel safe and if the rule of law is respected. And to that end, we're deepening our partnerships that help protect the security of Guatemalan citizens. So most tangibly and immediately in this space, we will work with the Arévalo administration in its first 100 days to disrupt illicit trafficking, including by helping to increase the number of highway checkpoints and by inaugurating a newly refurbished National Civil Police Command and Control Center in Guatemala City. And together, we're responsibly managing migration to provide safe, humane, and legal pathways while addressing the root causes of irregular migration, including years of economic hardship and corrosive governance, while making clear that our border is not open. Last week, I visited Guatemala, and it felt very differently from the last time I was in the country with Deputy Secretary Verma in early September. So let me just provide 4 quick observations from my visit. First, the indigenous community made its voice heard during the transition and will no longer tolerate its exclusion from the democratic process. I met with an impressive group of indigenous leaders for an over 2-hour lunch who are fully aware of the role they played in saving the country's democracy and really will accept nothing short of being full participants in the decisions being made, the decisions that lie ahead for the country. And the indigenous community's leadership, we feel, from the U.S. government perspective, will really be vital in the months and years ahead. And the international community can play a key role, not just the United States, but other actors in building the capacity of the indigenous community. This was a key ask that we heard. Support us, help build our capacity. When you're looking at trainings, when you're looking at scholarships, think of the indigenous community in a way that you haven't thought of us before. And that message was made very clear to us. Second, the private sector played a constructive role during the transition and will be a critical partner for the Arévalo administration. The Guatemalan private sector is not a monolith, and like any sector, includes undemocratic actors. But for the most part, this was a private sector that was unwilling to accept a stolen election. And more importantly, has expressed its willingness to find ways to collaborate with the new administration, including with regard to much needed infrastructure reforms, including with regard to efforts to put in place a long-sought competitiveness law that is currently under discussions in Congress. I was pleased to sit down with leaders across the private sector on Monday evening, hear about their active collaboration with the president and with his team. Third, Bernardo Arévalo, I think this audience knows this well, but is a pragmatist who seems willing to work with diverse sectors for outcomes that will benefit a broad swath of the Guatemalan population. He also understands that these efforts are good for the security and prosperity of our region as a whole. And then finally, in spite of all this optimism, I would say that the Guatemalan people's struggle against anti-democratic actors in Guatemala is not over. Last Monday afternoon, I visited imprisoned journalist Chepe Zamora in jail, and this would not have been possible under the previous administration. And I'm heartened that access to Chepe and to others is easing. But corrupt actors in the Attorney General's office and the judiciary remain in place, and efforts to punish anti-corruption leaders continue. So we cannot forget those brave justice sector leaders, many of whom are in exile here in Washington, elsewhere in the countries, who still cannot return to Guatemala. So in spite of this optimism, we still have major challenges from the Attorney General's office, from the judicial branch, that's important to think about. And I know that you've had some of those struggles yourself. The challenges that Central America faces are obviously significant, which is precisely, from my perspective, why it serves us well to pause, to have events like this one, Rebecca, every once in a while, and take stock of the progress that's been made. The experience in Guatemala over the last 6 months demonstrates to me why we should never give up hope that democratic moments are possible, even when, and I think perhaps especially when, we least expect them. So now it's really incumbent not only on the Guatemalan government, but I think all of us in the international community to demonstrate that democracy can indeed deliver. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here, and look forward to your questions and discussion. Thanks.
Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you, Ana Maria.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here with you all. Well, I will start, first of all, I will start to highlighting key historical moments of Guatemala in order to understand current challenges. First of all, I will say that we have had political opportunities and critical junctures to promote structural change, institutional reform, and to build democracy. Unfortunately, all these efforts have been blocked by elites and illicit networks. We had the opportunity in '84 to build democracy, and it was blocked. And then in '96 to build peace after the peace accords, and it was blocked by these elites. And in 2015, we had the opportunity to build the rule of law, and it also was blocked by these elites. So that continues to be the main struggle now in Guatemala, to build democracy, to build peace, and to build the rule of law again. I wanted to share with you something that Edelberto Torres Rivas, who is one of the Movimiento Semillas founding members, said. This is in Spanish, but I will try to translate it later. Estamos hablando de un actor social que se resiste a cambiar o morir políticamente y cuyas formas de constitución y poder se prolongan. It means that this elite resist to lose power. And they basically have evolved since the armed conflict into now the Guatemalan current context. So Bernardo Arévalo, Movimiento Semilla, are facing these power structures. And in order to rebuild the rule of law, he needs to find a mechanism to really start a process of dismantling them. CICIG tried, they did UN-backed International Commission Against Impunity, and they couldn't, and they actually were forced to leave the country under Jimmy Morales' administration. So one of the biggest challenges that I see is the lack of judicial independence. As long as the current Attorney General Office, Consuelo Porras, and the Constitutional Court remain controlled by corrupt elites, it will be difficult to move forward Arévalo's ambitious plans, particularly in addressing corruption. However, Movimiento Semilla has had the ability to build good coalitions and alliance, particularly in Congress, and they have tried to push measures to purge institutions of corruption and started to promote international cooperation on security issues and even climate change. So I'll try to highlight some positive measures that Bernardo Arévalo and Movimiento Semilla has taken since they took office in January 14. One is the institutional purge. As you all know, is when CICIG was in the country, they revealed a system of, in Spanish, is plazas fantasmas, who basically mean that there are like these ghost positions within the public administration. And so far, if I'm not wrong with numbers, at least 878 positions had been, that was hired in previous government had been terminated for people that have been or being linked with corruption or basically these plazas. One of the most important agreements that I think is important to mention here is, as Eric was mentioning, on the role of indigenous groups in protecting democracy, I think was the fact that on February 7th, Bernardo Arévalo signed an agreement with indigenous groups, and it was a very emblematic and important agreement because they are trying to address an historical problem of indigenous communities, which is access to land and to promote a state agrarian reform. which is very fundamental for indigenous groups that had been marginalized historically. And then, as also Eric mentioned, that he could visit Tepe Zamora, I think there is also openness to international scrutiny. It is important to mention that on February 12, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights visited the country. So we didn't see that previously with Alejandro Yamatei with other governments. And the fact that, for instance, Pedro Vaca and others, members of the commission, had the opportunity to visit Tepe Zamora as well, it was a great opportunity to highlight the importance of freedom of expression and civic space in Guatemala as well. Another one is governors. Local governors in Guatemala are appointed by the presidency. And Bernardo Arévalo has said that they are trying to appoint local authorities. And the good news about it is that indigenous groups are trying, they have applied, they are running for big governors. So there is an opportunity for indigenous groups to co-govern with Bernardo Arévalo at the local level, which is very important. And another thing is that in a recent visit of Arévalo to Europe, he signed a memorandum of understanding with the European Union, which was, in my opinion, very important because for the first time we are seeing that a president of Guatemala is talking about issues as a green transition and other areas of cooperation that Guatemala needs, trade, investment, and so on. He also inaugurated a specialized group against extortion. I think we will discuss a little bit about security measures. And I think the main focus of Arévalo on addressing citizen security is, it will be focused on extortion, which has at least 400 agents dedicated to capturing those involved in extortions. So that's one of the, in my opinion, the biggest achievements of so far of Bernardo Arévalo. And just briefly, I will just also mention some of the challenges that I see. One is that although this coalition in Congress has been very important in order to promote change and to promote a legislative agenda, an advanced legislative agenda, I think this coalition is fragile. It's fragile because it involves traditional political parties. Secondly, I think the Constitutional Court play a key role in defending Guatemala democracy, and unfortunately, many of the members are still linked with corrupt actors, and some of their decisions have affected Movimiento Semilla members. For instance, based on a constitutional resolution, Movimiento Semilla Congress members have been declared independent. So that limits their ability to for basically all their congressional work. So that's one of the challenges that I also see. And lastly, this year the Congress will select all magistrates of the Supreme Court. Only Guatemala, Bolivia, and Honduras select all members of magistrates in the same process. That's why all these processes are highly influenced or politically motivated. And I think that this selection process is important because what we have seen is that these illicit networks, these parallel actors and elites, they already have an strategy and a plan to co-opt again this process and to appoint some of the members, some candidates that will respond to their interests. So I would say, and we discussed this with some Guatemalans, that this selection process is as important as the selection of the general election or the election of Bernardo Arévalo. So I think that the international community should follow it and monitor this process, and also to help and assist all the civil society organizations that are monitoring this process as well.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria. Juan Luis.
I would like to start by saying that I'm very happy to be here, and I'm mostly happy because of Guatemala is driving an attention, a positive attention that is not driven for a long, long time. I think that this is very good for us Guatemalans, and even though I have to tell myself every other day that we have now much more hope than we used to have a year ago. We really thought that this wouldn't be possible. And we came to think on the night of the 25th or early morning on the 26th of June that this was really a miracle for us, that an independent candidate against the corruption was winning the election. I have to tell this to myself every other day because I tend to be kind of negative towards the signs of weakness and lack of effort, I would say, from the recently inaugurated government that we start to see. So to start with, the real challenge, the main challenge for Guatemala is fighting against chronic malnutrition. If you consider that 1 out of every 2 kids in Guatemala is malnourished, you may understand that this is really a challenge for us, and there's no way to evade it. And then, in order to be effective on a challenge like this, you really need kind of a choreography, a lot of institutions working all together at the same time, doing the proper things. And this is not going to happen unless we are able to fight against that capture, the cooptation of these institutions by the corruptive system in the country, which tends to make every 4 years a new bunch of millionaires coming out of the public funds in the country. I'm clear that President Arévalo understands this and conveys the idea that he is working exactly for this. However, the president, since he came to power, has decided not to confront directly this corruptive system, but to call for a more calm approach to the problem. He's all the time speaking about the need to respect the independence of powers, the independence of the different branches in the government, in the state. However, this is really getting very difficult. For instance, the courts have ruled that his political party, his Congress people, the Semilla, los diputados de Semilla, they simply don't have the capabilities that the rest of the congressmen have. Because of this corruptive judge, Judge Orellana, ruled that the party is officially suspended, and the Constitutional Court, against the Constitution, that's the position of many experts, they ruled that the judge was right. The president, of course, since he respects the independence of powers, hasn't come out to fight for his Congress people. And this is really been a very hard obstacle for them to start the fight against corruption from the Congress. As of today, we have a positive information about the parliamentary bloc of Semilla posing an initiative to change, to reform the law that allowed this judge to go against them and suspend the political party. However, there are other signs that kind of reflect President Arévalo weak in this fight. For instance, his lack of ability to call the Attorney General to step down, and even his lack of decision, I would say, to fight against her and to put her in a difficult positions by many ways that he could have and could have in hand. I think that President calm attitude, his disposition towards dialogue is positive and very mature in many ways. But there's also a need to address the people who voted for him and supported him throughout the campaign and even after he won the election, and give them reassurance that he is really going to look for achieving what he was asked to do, which is finishing with this corrupted system and, for instance, starting a reform on the judiciary, which he hasn't addressed so far. I have to say that today we also have an issue that may be very positive, and that is that the Presidential Commissioner Against Corruption, young lawyer Santiago Palomo, was invited by the Attorney General to attend a meeting with her, and he publicly came out saying that he is not meeting the Attorney General because he has a lot of work to do to fight against corruption, and he rather meet with people who is properly disposed to fight against the corruptives again, not like the Attorney General. So I think that President Arévalo really has a big challenge in terms of how to put the institutions to work to solve the most important problems of the population of the country. And on the other hand, at the same time, how to push for that reform that the country really needs, because otherwise these institutions, that many of them are in the hands of corruptives, are not going to allow the system to work properly towards the objectives that we consider the most important. I would stay there, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much for the comments. I want to start, I'm going to pose two questions and then we'll open it up to the audience. But Eric pointed out this idea that Arévalo is a pragmatist, and Juan Luis, I really appreciated your perspective. He does face this uphill battle when it comes to the judiciary, for sure. And as we all know, without judicial autonomy, the rule of law, it's impossible. And as we also all know, what happened in Guatemala to the judiciary is not unique. You have a democratically elected presidents who systematically dismantle the independence of the courts and other institutions, basically checks and balances. So my question then is, and also I'll also add that the point about the Supreme Court justice, it does seem like there's an opportunity this year that should be seized. And your point about the internet, keeping the international community, keeping an eye on that, local civil society engagement, I think is really important, because we all know that you could have on paper the best appointment process, but it can be very easily captured. So my question is, in order to start to rebuild an autonomous judicial branch, what is that going to take? And what would you advise? What would you advise the president? And my second question is related, and it's about security in the context of the rule of law. Guatemala is not alone in facing these challenges, the illicit networks that have penetrated government and that are wreaking havoc on society. But the Bukele model has become very popular. And I think that we have a president in Guatemala who understands liberal democracy and what it means. So I'm wondering if Arévalo and his administration could perhaps provide an alternative, or think about maybe working with the US government, because Bukele's model is catching on like wildfire. And we see his popularity in places like Chile. We're talking about Costa Rica. So what about the opportunity in Guatemala to create an alternative model of citizen security that is within a rule of law framework that respects human rights? That's a tough task, I know, but I'm going to leave it open to you to respond to these three questions. Eric, I don't know if you want to go first and we can just go down and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions.
Sure. Thanks, Rebecca. Great questions with not easy answers. I would say, and defer to the experts on sort of the processes in Guatemala, but on the Supreme Court selection process, as well as anything else in Guatemala, I guess my big takeaway is that these democratic moments don't last forever. And so you have Arévalo has a presidency, but also as a governing coalition in Congress. And I think it's really critical. And I think the government recognizes this to take advantage of this moment. And I think thinking about a number of things, whether you're thinking about the Supreme Court selection process, whether you're thinking about other reforms, it's important not to lose momentum because you never know how quickly things can go in another direction. So I think timing is critical. In terms of rule of law and security, I absolutely agree with you that there's a good opportunity here. I would just note that our new ambassador, Toby Bradley, who's fantastic, comes from INL, comes from our Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, has spent a lot of time. He led the INL section in Mexico City, really understands these citizen security issues well. So I think we've no better champion for a policy and rule of law based on democratic norms than our new ambassador. And I absolutely agree there's good opportunities to sort of build on positive experiences and not resort to strongman tactics.
Thank you. On the judiciary, on your question about the Supreme Court, I will start to saying that for the long term, it's important to recognize, and I think it was recognized in 2016 when CC work and others and civil society in Guatemala work for a constitutional reform. There is an issue in how the system has been designed and how the process had been design over the years. I think the case of comisiones paralelas, of CC, and so on reflects how the system, how illicit networks have historically influenced these processes. So I think it is urgent a constitutional reform on the mechanisms to appoint magistrates of the Supreme Court. As I say, the fact that all 13 magistrates of the Supreme Court will be appointed, it makes these processes more political motivated as well. Secondly, I think for the short term, I think Bernardo Arévalo should have an strategy with their own political party, Movimiento Semilla. In the end, Congress are the responsible to appoint magistrates of the Supreme Court, but also the courts of appeals. So I think there should be an strategy because I would say that the Pacto de Corruptos and all these illicit networks will play all the cards on this selection process. They are not willing again, as they did in 84, in 96, and then in 2015 to lose power. And this process is very important for them. So I think that, yeah, as I said before, it would be important that international mechanisms such as the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and so on can monitor this process and guarantee, or to at least call on basic guarantees that will be needed for these processes. On the security issue, yeah, I think it's a good question. I haven't seen actually a real plan to address insecurity in Guatemala, and I think it's very complex. I think we shared similar issues with El Salvador, and the fact that the presence of gang-related violence and these groups called Maras and so on. But I think the Bukele model has something very particular that we haven't talked too much about, and is the fact that Bukele has negotiated with these criminal groups. In Honduras, Xiomara Castro, in December 2022, and it was extended until now, they have also a state of exception, but it hasn't been very successful because Xiomara Castro hasn't negotiated with gangs and these criminal groups. So I think it's a great question. I think civil society organizations, we are trying to think about what would be the alternative of a security model based on human rights, because it's very dangerous that Bukele is threatening the idea that democracy and human rights are not compatible with citizen security. And one question that I have had, and also I had conversation with the Norway government as well, because they have been involved in peace building processes, and they said, to what extent is valid to negotiate with criminal groups? When you work with in the peace building processes, you have to sit with both parts of the conflict and say, okay, let's let's negotiate it, right? So those are the questions that are there, but I haven't seen any a real plan of Bernardo Arévalo beyond the extortion measures that I already mentioned.
I think that President Arévalo should be addressing constantly the need in Guatemala to make a renovation of the judiciary. And I think that even if he is very respectful of liberal democracy and he really thinks that he should respect the independence of powers, this is really such an important matter for all Guatemalans and for the whole state that it requires real leadership, and the president should not be ignoring it publicly. I think that the president might have many instruments, like calling even the Corte Suprema de Justicia to discuss the matter. How are we going to have, say, in 10 years, better judges and more professional ones? How the president could really get the whole country speaking about this and putting pressure towards the judges and magistrates. I think that this is important, and as I say, he has a lot of ways to underline it. On the other hand, I think that the Ministro de Gobernación, the Señor Francisco Jiménez, he's approaching to the insecurity and extortion, I would say, in the proper way. He's respecting human rights compared to Mr. Bukele, and he's trying to single out and to focus precisely on the people that is on the top of these organizations that extort many Guatemalans. However, I have two doubts to raise. One is, we have seen these efforts before, and they have not been as effective as I wish they had. What is going to be different this time? Is he really going to get under control the penitentiary system, which is where most of these gang leaders call people to extort from? Then is the judiciary going to be coherent with the effort that the executive, the government, is trying to do? Mr. Bukele, however, how critic we could be of him, he was really successful because he was able to put in line the judiciary, the police, I mean, the Attorney General's office. I wonder if Mr. Jimenez is going to be able to be as effective as we wish he was.
Now to questions from the audience. Ambassador McFarland, and then if you could just introduce yourself. And I just introduced you, but going forward.
Good afternoon, Steve McFarland, former Foreign Service officer, former U.S. ambassador to Guatemala. First, you'll apologize if I make one comment, but Eric and Rebecca, I have to congratulate you on the conduct of U.S. policy towards Guatemala this last half year to a year. Everything you said is accurate about what Washington was doing and the embassy from my perspective. But I want to add that I think you showed a superb, really outstanding ability to take calculated risks and to implement them with relative agility, rare in a large organization. And so congratulations to all of your team for that. Question would be, all of you pointed out the fact that the election is over, but regime change basically is still up in the air. So to introduce the idea of a red team, if you or your people were in the Pacto Corruptos, and your goal, of course, is not just to to blockade and undermine the government, but ideally to overturn it and go back to the status quo ante. What are the 2 or 3 things you would be trying to do right now? Of course, that ideally Arévalo and his foreign supporters would be watching out for.
Excellent question. So maybe this time we'll go, should we start
other
with you,
way
Juan Luis, and go and
You mean, if I were a member of the Pacto de Corruptos, what I would try to guarantee for the success of my task? I would fight against the possibility that Semilla wins the reform, is able to pass the reform of the Ley de Delincuencia Organizada, because I think that is key. If they are able to pass that reform of the law, the Corte de Constitucionalidad, which I see on the side of the Pacto de Corruptos, would have to go much further to defend the position against the Partido Semilla. I have seen, I would say, positively surprised that these young Congress people of Partido Semilla were able to get an alliance and accord with many different groups in the parliament, and they have been able to face the Pacto de Corruptos, I would say, properly in the first weeks. And I think that if they have all the capabilities that they have been taken off, they would be a very important challenge for the Pacto de Corruptos and for the statu quo in Guatemala. Because in Congress, we see the people that is more willing to convey, to bring really deliver change in the system in Guatemala. I would say I would try to avoid that if I were a member of the Pacto de Corruptos.
I would say that lift the immunity of Bernardo Arévalo and Karin Herrera. I think this is a threat. There is a current threat. I think the Attorney General continues. There are still many legal challenges, and there is a case built against Movimiento Semilla. And I think that the fact that they couldn't prevent Bernardo Arévalo from taking office, they'll still have this case saying that there was fraud, or how this Movimiento Semilla was created, or about the signatures of the members of Movimiento Semilla. So they have these cases there, and we need to be aware that they will try to continue prosecuting and criminalizing Movimiento Semilla, not just Bernardo Arévalo, but also Movimiento Semilla members. I think, if I'm not wrong, Samuel Perez has been, the Attorney General's office requested some information around.
It's trying to build up a new case
Yeah.
against him.
So they'll be trying to harass, basically, legally, Movimiento Semilla members, including Bernardo Arévalo.
Thanks. And just let me mention also, thanks, Ambassador McFarland, who's been such a champion for Guatemala for so many years, and who back in the fall, and I can't remember if it was in September or October, gave us all advice which served us well, which was what you all have done in Guatemala so far. It's pretty good, but it's not going to serve you until January 14th. So you guys need to up the game over the next couple of months. So that advice was definitely well listened to and appreciated. So thank you for your leadership on these issues. I think it's a great question, and I think the answers are really important. I would also add that I think fracturing the congressional coalition is something, if you were thinking about on the other side, something that you could do is, this is a congressional coalition that frankly I didn't expect. I think, because of the overreach from the other side, we got to the point that that Arévalo actually has a governing coalition in Congress. I personally expected, Katia mentioned Peru on the way in, I personally expected a situation like we've seen in the Peru in the past, where you'd have a Congress that would be constantly trying to impeach the president-elect. So the fact that you have a president who comes into office with a governing coalition is really important, is really critical, but that's fragile. And so I think the fear is returning to patterns of the past with regard to corruption and otherwise to try to get members of Congress on the other side. So I think that's something to watch out for, and obviously to take advantage of, the Congress that you have in this moment.
Hey, let's take two questions at once. So Bernardo, you're gonna have to run from one side of the room to the other.
Hi, I'm José Luis Sanz, the journalist at El Faro. I have two questions. One is, how far do you think that Bernardo Arévalo will go in terms of involving indigenous voices and the indigenous authorities or movements in his government? And two, where the private sector stands now? Because during the power transition, in my opinion, they played both sides. Even the decent part of the private sector in Guatemala, how committed are they with a democratic government?
Good afternoon. My name is Lawrence Pratt from Inkai Business School, based in Costa Rica. So following on the colleagues' conversation, Eric, you had mentioned your visits to the private sector and the work that the embassy in Guatemala is doing. We know there's a vast majority of the private sector wants Guatemala to be successful and want it to be a cleaner country. The question is the question for all three of you, really, how best can we engage that majority, that large portion of the private sector, to actually participate and bring another pillar to that stability of these processes? Thank you.
Start with you, Eric.
Really good questions. I think on the indigenous piece, my sense, and I welcome the comments of the real experts here, is that there's a real commitment from President Arévalo and his team, and I think there's a recognition of the critical role that the indigenous community played during the transition. And what I often saw as an indigenous community that was strong in its own way, but didn't really exercise, didn't use its political muscle, I think that's changed in a way that I think is good for everybody in the country. So I'm optimistic on that front, but I do think that we all, not just the United States, but the entire international community, needs to support that strong role of the indigenous community moving forward. On the private sector, I would say, again, I don't think it's a monolith. I do think there are a lot of positive signs during the transition. I remember early on during the transition speaking to one reporter who called me and said, I said something positive about the role the private sector was playing, and she said, "Really? What are you talking about? I've never heard somebody speak this way about the private sector in Guatemala." But I think there's a number of factors here. I mean, I think one is that Bernardo Arévalo is at heart a pragmatist. In spite of some trying to paint him as a radical leftist, he's really a centrist who wants to work with the private sector, wants to promote investment in the country. You saw the event he did last week with Fundesa and the Atlantic Council. I mean, so early on, he's pushing for these things. We're working closely with them to put together a high-level economic dialogue. So I think, from a private sector perspective, I think some of the images that some of the radicals put out there are just inaccurate. So I think there's space to work together, to your question as well. So yes, I mean, I do think, are there outliers in the private sector, those who continue to promote efforts to, investigate those fighting corruption, all of those things that we've seen in the past? Certainly, I think there's individuals there. But by and large, I do see a private sector that wants to work on a common agenda that, and I think, why did they not want this election to be stolen? Well, number of reasons, but I think, I think you can look at the example of COSEP in Nicaragua, for example. Nobody wanted to see a Nicaragua-like example. Nobody wanted to have the country go in that direction. So I think at the end of the day, Arévalo's pragmatism in many ways has driven the private sector to a very good place. And I'm relatively optimistic about where that relationship goes.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a great question, Jose Luis, on the indigenous group, because what I mentioned before, I think is key, because promoting agrarian reform or access to land reform, I think is structural. And I think these will empower more indigenous groups. So I think this is a good measure that Bernardo Arévalo has taken. However, there is a saying in Spanish that is, no puedes quedar bien con Dios ni con el diablo. So we have the private sector and we have indigenous group and we have Bernardo Arévalo in the middle. So any action towards protect indigenous groups, historical marginalized groups, structural issues such as access to land will be seen as a threat from the private sector. And any coalition or any agreement with the private sector will be seen as a threat against indigenous groups, because these groups have been like historically not unit. So that's, we will see. It's only 30 days. And as I said, like, no puedes quedar bien con Dios y con el diablo. And I think that's the main struggle of Bernardo Arévalo so far. On the private sector, as Eric mentioned, I think it's very diverse, but I would say that when I previously mentioned that all this effort of democratization of Guatemala had been blocked, and I mentioned elites, I need to say that those elites are from the economic and private sector as well. So I wonder, like, I agree that there are new generations, there are new groups that are willing to do the things differently, but there are other groups that are very, very rooted in this system of exclusion, that they won't want to lose any power. And those have a lot of power in Guatemala. So we will see, and it's too soon, but again, I think that's one of the biggest challenges of Bernardo Arévalo, being in the middle of these two, now I would say a political force that has become the indigenous groups as well.
On the indigenous matter, I have the feeling that the Presidente Arévalo is going to appoint some of the indigenous leaders as governors if they end up being in the final list that is going to be given to him. I think that he's going to look for this kind of way to give an answer to the petition of participation that the indigenous people has justly made. I don't see any sign that the government is preparing any policy or any big way to address the structural situation in Guatemala that keeps us indigenous and non-indigenous or mestizos segregated as we really are in life. And I would say that this would even start by addressing this publicly and having this included in the in the communication of the government. So I don't see any sign of that reach so far. On the private sector issue, you were dividing them between the decent and non-decent. The non-decent are going to be doing the same as they have been doing for long decades. The decent ones, I think that there's a challenge for the government. The Guatemalan government has usually resigned its role as a regulator before the private sector. They simply give the positions as Ministerio de Economía or Superintendencia de Telecomunicaciones or many other positions to the private sector so that they don't have somebody who's going to be bugging them on many issues. I think that the government is willing really to play the role of regulator, and his big challenge is going to be if they are able to persuade the decent private sector that this role is really needed to be played in a liberal democracy. I am looking right now at have you seen that they just approved that el Congreso de Defensoría de Derechos del Consumidor? Well, I have seen both CACIF and the Consejo Nacional Empresarial. They are both complaining about the law because they say that they have some negative incentives and that it might be harmful for the whole society, they say, but we understand that for their interests. We have to see how the government and even the Congress is able to deal with this. For instance, if the president is going to be sanctioning the law, or he's going to ask the Congress to make some reforms before having it signed.
Of time. I know there are a lot of questions coming in virtually. I'm so sorry we don't have a chance to get to them. But I do think one of the big takeaways that I will leave this discussion with is Eric made the point about these democratic moments and that timing is key. They don't last forever. We're clearly in one of those moments right now. So time is of the essence. And a key issue is going to be able to, for the president to be able to show that democracy indeed delivers. especially at a moment where there is very little faith in democracy across the region. And when it comes to issues like poverty and inequality, your point about malnutrition, it is going to be important that the private sector play a role in ensuring success. And as you said, it's also critical that the indigenous movement and the other elements of civil society remain active and watchful. So I'm going to leave it at that and just thank everyone so much for coming, and special thank you to our great panelists. Thank you all.